All right, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Time of martyrs,
Pray for us.
St. Thomas Aquinas,
Pray for us.
and Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, so to start today off, we still have to finish off chapter 3, the object of the intellect. And the last segment we had to go over was on judgments. All right, so for some refresher, a judgment, when we say judgment, it's the act of the intellect where it's composing or dividing concepts. It's making affirmations or it is denying qualities of certain realities. So when you say the ladder is green, that is a verbal expression of a judgment where you're uniting the two concepts of green and ladder and saying these are the same thing in this instance. So we compose and divide concepts and reason about things. All right, that's unique to human nature. So the way that this manifests itself is in syllogistic reasoning. And when you do reasoning, the truth of the conclusion, sorry, I went too fast, is contained within the premises. And reasoning is just deduction is a process of coming at truth that was already kind of latent in the premise to begin with. So here's an example. All men are mortal. You are a man. Okay, so what is the conclusion to be drawn from these series of judgments?
You are mortal.
That you are mortal as well, okay? At what moment did you realize that you were mortal?
When I realized I was a man?
Is that how it worked for you?
No.
I mean, like, seriously, when did you first contemplate your own mortality? And so what I'm trying to illustrate is you can make these recognitions, but reasoning is an actual process by which you do come to some new truth. All right? Maybe you realized your mortality when you read Charlotte's Web.
I probably did when I was doing something stupid. I was like, oh, I can die here.
Yeah, you can die here. Okay, so the intellect works by a step-by-step process. All right, and so while this truth was already contained in these premises, it's possible to just have these premises and then not make the next step. And from these premises, you can come to make new things. So you are mortal. I don't know. You could make another syllogism off of that.
Coco, or the dog Coco, is not mortal, therefore you are not the dog Coco.
Rosie is immortal, therefore I'm not Rosie. Yeah, I guess so. I was just trying to give you guys an example of something where, clearly you do need to make the next step in the reasoning process. Or like, here's another one that a lot of people have, but they don't always get the full implications of, is that creation exists is one premise that everyone can recognize. And then another judgment that all people know is that all created things need a creator. And then what's the conclusion? The creator has to have made creation. This creation, okay? And that's what people refer to as God. But you can that's an example how you can hold these judgments, but reasoning is a process where you can really come to newer, deeper truth. Using the process of deduction. Angels and the divine intellect do not function in this way. All right, so while man has to arrive at knowledge through a series of steps, the angelic intellect is able to grasp all truth without reasoning. All right, and so, so if an angel knows that it exists, right, it doesn't need to be explained that there must be a creator, because it's going to understand all the implications of, like, I'm existing, I was temporal, I was not existing, I have to come from somewhere. All that happens instantaneously. And so that's why we say angelic intellects are higher than man's, right? So, like, we kind of are slow, we have to go through these steps and these processes, and it's kind of difficult. So these higher spiritual beings, it just happens instantaneously. And then here's something that Elle is really not going to like. All right, so some of the implications from this. Hence, they are higher or more intelligent. Secondly, they do not alter their wills because of this. All right, the will follows the intellect. The will follows what the intellect apprehends. Because an angelic intellect is capable of apprehending everything simultaneously and there's no steps involved, once it makes its decision, it's final, according to its nature. All right? Yes, Michael?
Then how were there fallen angels if they understood everything?
Because how do angels learn?
Instantly?
Okay, but like, how do you learn? What's the basis of all your knowledge?
Someone tells me something and then I take that information and go from there.
Okay, or your senses. Okay, angels don't have ears. They don't have eyes. They don't have senses. So where are they getting their sense data from? They don't have sense data. All right, so you can't talk about them in terms of having sense data. So what Thomas says in tradition, angels receive knowledge through divine infusion. They get knowledge on a need-to-know basis directly from God. All right. So when an angel then, the fall of the angels, according to the general tradition, okay, is that they rebel because what's revealed to them is the incarnation and Mary's status as a human, as Queen of Angels. All right, and so because Lucifer, he's such this high being, okay, and he's the highest of the angels, and then he's going to be made subject to a lower being like Mary. That would be, in this understanding of this story, is that's his pride, and so he rejects God's plan. Okay. Now again, that's more like on the level of tradition. I don't think the church has anything doctrinally as to what specifically did cause the fall, but as best as theologians, that's kind of like the guess they take. And you kind of get a hint of that in the book of Revelation as well. So, does that answer your question? So, once the angels are made aware of God's plan, then they fall. Okay, and also they could not have had the beatific vision prior to them being tested with that plan. All right, you can think of them having that plan as like their tree of knowledge of good and evil that they have to make a test and overcome. Does that make sense? Okay. Now here's the thing you guys are really going to push back on. Another consequence of this is that they are incapable of human humor. They don't get jokes. They don't laugh.
That is a
They don't have
sad-
lungs or throats to laugh with anyway. But yeah, because humor, everything that is a joke is always a misdirection or a intentional misstep in the reasoning process. It's when something's incongruent and you come across an incongruency and then it strikes you as funny. But because angels don't reason by step the same way humans do, well then, they're not going to find it as appealing. Okay. What if God gave them infusion of a joke one bit at a time, but then they find it funny? I don't know.
What about puns?
The thing about puns is that it's an abstract, it's a twist in the reasoning process. And that's why it's kind of like a tickle of the intellect, so to speak. Okay, even there, I don't know, there's something you guys weren't expecting me to use that phrase. You found it kind of funny. Think of this as like a humorous scene. A guy's walking down the street. Okay, the camera's on him walking down the street. The camera cuts away. Down the road, there's a banana peel. All right, cuts back to the guy. He's still walking down the street. Kind of zooms out. He's getting close to the banana peel. Cuts back up to the banana peel. Cuts back to the guy. And the next thing you know, he falls down a manhole. Okay, because it's unexpected, right? It's like you're expecting the reasoning process is coming along and then the rug's pulled out from under your feet, right? When you have instantaneous intellect stuff, that doesn't happen. Yes, Ella?
Is there another kind of humor? Did you say human humor?
I did say human humor to leave the possibility open,
Okay.
but yeah. Yeah, I said human humor to leave the possibility open, but that is no way affirming that there is actually another type of humor. Okay, so that concludes chapter 3. We're now going to begin chapter 4. Which is on the will. All right, so one of the names for the will is the rational appetite. It's kind of like the most precise definition you could give of this power. As the rational appetite, we have to explain how it's distinct from our other appetites. And this, I think, a lot of people who don't study philosophy can't comprehend this. So it's important to be able to explain this clearly. It's distinct from the sensitive appetites. All right, so some people are really disturbed. This was a couple years ago with some students. In theology class, the teacher was talking about how God doesn't have emotions. And they thought, God doesn't have emotions. Why does God do anything then? And it's like, really? Are you implying that every decision you make is based off of emotions? Because that's might be true, I guess, with certain individuals, but it's definitely not what human nature is confined to. The reason God doesn't have emotions is because it's not a body, right? Emotionals are a physical bodily reaction. So the rational appetite, the ability to choose, right, to love, these things, they're distinct from the sensitive appetites. And this is what separates the two. The will is moved by what is apprehended. Sam, can you quiet down, please? The will is moved by what is apprehended by the intellect. While the sense appetite is moved by what?
Senses?
Yeah, what's apprehended by the senses. By sense apprehensions. Okay, what's another term for the sense appetite? What's a name you can call them?
Emotions.
The emotions, yeah, or the passions. All right. So when I say sense appetites, just remember I'm talking about the emotions here. What are the sense apprehensions?
Taking in sense data.
Yeah, your sense data. Okay, and then also your phantasms as well. Okay. Also, another distinction between the will and the sense appetite and how we know they're not the same thing is that the will is able to move or not move. While the appetites, the sense appetites, the passions, always move when acted on. All right, so you can apprehend that something is good and desirable intellectually, and then choose to do nothing about it. All right, and your will doesn't take any action. You can smell something, baking in the oven and you're hungry, whatever, and you don't have any control over the emotional response of desire that you have, all right, towards, like, say, the chocolate chip cookies, all right? That's an involuntary thing, all right? So one of the distinctions between the two is that one set of appetites is involuntary, the other appetite, the will, is voluntary, all right? It can rest and proceed forward as it so chooses. Is there any questions or confusion about that? Are you confused?
Maybe, but if you just keep going, I think
If I keep going, maybe it'll clear up. Probably not, because I'm moving on to another topic now. So, do you have a question?
no, I'll figure it out. I'll just reread it.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to take a look at distinctions in the will itself. All right, so first we're going to talk about determination. Is the will determined? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, it is. And no. Okay, so most of the time, if you ever take another philosophy class, the answer is going to be yes and no. There's your little cheat sheet to learn right now. All right, so is the will determined? The answer to that question is both yes and no. Philosophers seldom affirm. Philosophers seldom deny. Philosophers always distinguish. Okay, so we're going to make a distinction on how the will is determined. So first is the positive. Yes, it is determined by its nature towards what? Anyone know? Kaylee?
Can I go to the bathroom?
Sure.
Universal goodness, or like,
Yeah, the good. It's determined towards the good as an end. All right, the end that the will pursues, its goal is always going to be goodness. For that reason, it will never pursue evil as such. It's always going to be going after something that perceives, that's being apprehended as good. Secondly, it's not determined, it's free. With respect to how it achieves the end. All right, so the will can choose between a multiplicity of means freely in order to obtain its end, which is goodness. Okay, and when you possess good, another way of saying the end is goodness is that the end is happiness. Happiness is the possession of the good. Okay, so you can say that the end of the will is happiness. All right, achieving its goal of obtaining goodness. Another round of distinctions we'll make is talking about the necessities in the will. Necessity in the will. So the first kind of necessity, Thomas makes a distinction between 3 or 4 different types of necessities. It was kind of hard to keep track, so I'm just going to be going over 3 that he explains in the excerpt from the Summa that we had from the Flippin packet. And the first is natural necessity. All right, natural necessity is what occurs in a thing because of its nature. So, for example, a material thing decomposes. All right, you as a material entity are bound to decompose. This school as a material structure, right, is bound towards decomposition. That is a natural necessity. Does the will have a natural necessity? Yes or no?
Is this one of those yes and no things?
Yeah, it's actually an exception. It's just one of them. And the answer is yes. So the will does have a natural necessity. And the natural necessity that it has ties into the determination above. The will necessarily, in a natural necessity, adheres to the last end of happiness. All right, or as I said previously, possessing a good. All right, it's as common as like dogs barking. Dogs bark according to their nature. That's a necessary thing. The will is driven towards happiness as its end, as its goal. That's a natural thing. All right, it's that kind of natural necessity. A second kind of necessity is necessity of the end. And so an example of necessity of the end would be, it is necessary to eat food to live. All right, if you want to live, well, then it is a necessity that you're going to eat food. If you want to cross the sea, then it is of a necessity that you find a ship. Okay? And so this type of necessity can also be applied to the will. So if you possess the will to cross the sea, necessitates the will to find a ship. The last kind of necessity is necessity of coercion. Necessity of coercion is the kind of necessity where violence is done to an object. Or a more colloquial way of expressing it is something is forced. So when the scholastics, when the philosophers talk about violence in this sense, they don't mean like, gore and all that stuff, but that meaning that we have of violence does derive itself from this original meaning of violence. Okay, so as I carry the pen across the room, okay, philosophically, I'm doing violence to this pen, and it is necessarily moving with me. It has no resistance. Okay, me doing this is necessitating its movement as well. Okay, forcing something to happen, doing violence. This type of necessity is repugnant to the will. There's nothing our will hates more than being forced into coercion. All right, it's like it will never want to go along with that. Okay, so being forced to do something at gunpoint, right? That would be an example of necessity by means of coercion. You're being forced along to it, but you can still, using your will, resist that type of coercion. Or if you're like being dragged across the room against your will, it's always going to be repugnant to the nature. Okay, any questions on the necessities found in the will? All right, so necessity is an analogous term. It has multiple different meanings. And so when you talk about the will being necessary and inclined, Thomas makes these different distinctions to show you can talk about the will being necessary in this way, but you can't talk about being necessary in that way, etc., so on and so forth. All right, and then to conclude the class, we're going to look at a question that Thomas raises in the Summa. Is the will necessarily bound to what it desires? All right, so what is the object that the will desires? What is the object of the will? Louisa.
Goodness.
Goodness, universal goodness, total goodness. Okay. Is the will, all right, so where do you find universal total goodness? God. Okay. So you can identify God synonymously as the end of the will. Right? God is the infinite goodness, universal goodness. The will is determined towards that. So what Thomas is really dealing with is the will necessarily bound to God as its object of desire? And what is the answer, Michael?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. So we'll walk through this in the following manner. Okay. God is the supreme good. And hence, the will is satisfied with the beatific vision. All right, this philosophical idea is it's expressed in a very famous quote from St. Augustine. You've probably heard, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord." Okay, and it's like the will is always going to be restless, going from good to good, until it actually attains the supreme good. Now, the problem is that the will, or the intellect, does not currently behold the beatific vision. And so you're not necessarily bound to having God as the object of your will, because you don't have the apprehension for the will to follow, to be necessarily conformed to that. All right, so B, the will is not necessarily bound to the beatific vision, because the will is only moved by what is apprehended by the intellect. And currently in this life, letter C, the intellect, the beatific vision is not apprehended. If you are watching this class, the beatific vision is not currently being apprehended by the intellect. So the will remains free to choose which good it desires.